Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ninth episode of Tech Talks with Santosh. And today we have a very special guest, Jan-Niklas Wortmann. He is part of the NGRX core team. He is also an Angular GDE. He works on the enterprise applications. So he's a consultant and works on really large enterprise applications with RxJs, Angular, and multiple stacks. So welcome to the Tech Talks with Santosh, Nicholas.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for accepting the invite. And
Always.
today we are today we are going to talk about a really important topic because this is where I also struggle a lot, RxJs, and we are also going to talk about how we can start thinking reactively because that's the biggest pain point when I talk about RxJs, even when I have to explain someone. So I reached out to Jan and said, let's try to simplify it and let's have a chat. And he was really generous to actually accept the invitation, and we have this episode now. So, Jan, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
Doing great.
Nice.
So this DevFest started today, so you can see DevFest mood right now. Okay. So Jan, so before we start talking about reactive programming, I think it is really important to understand what functional programming is.
Yes.
So can we just talk a little bit about it?
Sure. So you don't have to be like super deep into functional programming to work efficiently with RxJs, but you at least need to understand the core concepts of it. And like in contrast to object-oriented programming, which primary entity you're working on is a object usually, in functional programming, it's the function. So what you're usually doing is you're using functions to concatenate and to build up your program flow. So this is fairly what functional programming is about. There are way more in-depth concepts about that, but on a high level, that's what functional programming is about. What's very important for functional programming is the concept of pure and impure functions. And on a high level, a pure function is a function that is side effect free.
Okay.
And these concepts apply very well to RxJs, which is an declarative reactive approach. What does that mean? Reactive just, instead of dealing with functions or something like that, considers, instead of describing what you're doing, is describing, okay, if something happens, then execute that. That's a fundamental difference of how you structure your code. Like in functional programming, you say execute this, execute that, execute this, do that, whatever. Yeah. In reactive programming, you say, okay, if this happens, do this and that.
Okay.
So you're reacting to some certain conditions. And but the concepts besides that from functional programming still apply. So you're still concatenating functions, and that is actually where this declarative approach comes from. So instead of saying, okay, you're just having an API based on observables, with declarative programming, you have an API that describes in a declarative manner, if that happens, apply this operator. This is pretty much where the declarativity comes from, probably. Sounds about right.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is a fundamental difference between those two. Like functional programming says, do this, do that, do this. And reactive programming is, when this happens, then do this. And this is really difficult to embrace because everyone, at least that I met from university or learned programming, is having this object-oriented flow in mind always. This still kind of works for functional programming. But it's fundamentally different for reactive programming. And to learn this is really, from my point of view, what is difficult about RxJs. The operators and all that stuff, this is tricky sometimes. There are some operators that are tricky, I completely agree, but you also barely need those. They're very specialized. What's difficult from my point of view about RxJs is getting into this thinking reactively. And
sorry.
So then, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dan. Okay, so to start with, right? So you said, okay, the most important thing to understand is actually how to think reactively. How did you started? I mean, how you started understanding RxJS and then eventually become part of RxJS team as well?
Okay, so it's actually a quite funny story. So how I started with getting into the RxJS team. So first I had an Angular project and I saw RxJS in there for the first time. I had never heard about it before. And I liked the concept, but I was not able at all to use it properly. I didn't understood it. And with this didn't change within the whole project, right? I used it when I saw it was needed, but it was terrible and so wrong. Now that I know about RxJS, I know how wrong I did. But anyway, as a consultant, at some point of time, I moved over to a different project. And this was not Angular related anymore, but Java. But I knew it already at that time, okay, I want to keep up with Angular. I want to go back to Angular again. So I wanted to do something Angular related in my free time. And what I did is, at this point of time, Tracy started an initiative to rework the docs. And I got involved in that, contributed, and this was how I learned about operators, how I get more involved in that, and in the end, also how I became part of the core team. And from there on, I constantly learned about RxJS and tried to apply my knowledge in situations, in my projects. And this is pretty much what brought me where I am right now, like forcing myself, okay, here's a scenario, and I know already I can use RxJS for that. But even though it might not be the best solution for that, just let's do it for now, like that, just so that I can get myself into that. And honestly, it sounds really dry and very easy, but like doing stuff reactively is the best way to learn it, because then notice like you have the best scenarios in that situation. You have a very reduced set of operators that you will apply, and you will notice after time like, oh, okay, now switch map is behaving this and like that, and merge map is behaving like that. And then you start to like, okay, this is because this is doing that and this is doing that. You start to connect all the pieces, and like everyone I talk to has this some moment in time where it's like, it's just making click and you're like, I got it. That's the way it's working. And from there on, you're moving on and constantly improving. And some people actually have multiple of those click moments, where it's always like, oh, okay, arrows are working like that, and they are ending the observable. Oh, okay, that makes sense. And this is also the reason why in catch error, I have to apply and return a new observable that it can subscribe to. Okay, gotcha. This is pretty much how I got into that. And also, I started at the same time, like doing talks about RxJS, just to recap on my knowledge. And this also helped me a lot, just to recap, think about it. Can I describe it in a way that others understand what I'm saying? And often I was in a situation where I was like, okay, I think I got it, but apparently not, because I'm not able to explain it properly yet. So I sat down myself, browsed the docs, watched videos, read articles, checked a lot of the source code actually. And this brought me in the end to the situation where I am right now. Like, I think I have a fairly good understanding of RxJS, not compared to like Ben or Nicholas Jamieson. When they are discussing, and so we have a bi-weekly meeting, when they are discussing stuff, I'm sitting there sometimes like, okay, I agree, whatever. It's crazy.
I mean, so what I can understand is you started from the same place from where I think most of the Angular developers started. So even in my scenario, I think I heard RxJS for the first time when I started working with Angular. It was back in 2017. So I was like, okay, so this HTTP service, right? So HTTP service returns observable. And let me tell you, the docs were not at all helpful, the Angular docs. At that time, I mean, it's improving.
Yeah.
It's improving. So it was not at all helpful. I was like, okay, maybe something. I mean, okay, let's leave it. So let's use HTTP and then move. I think I did an entire project with my last employer. So we had not even a single subscription. So I mean, it was so just to ask you, right? So I'm sure you might have been in this situation as well. Most of the developers might have. Actually, when we were working on the project, so there was a huge fight, not fight, basically the discussion about we should use promises or observables.
Yes.
So have you been into this situation before?
Always. In every single project, actually.
So how okay.
To be fair, my perspective on this changed a lot during the time. So in the beginning, I was like, okay, Angular is coming with observables. We should use them. And when I'm in the project, I can guide the team to use them properly, to prevent faults they might do and stuff like that. So I'm still kind of in that situation where I would say, okay, let's use observables every time. Just because everything you can do with a promise, you can do with an observable, but not the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
In the meantime, my perspective changed a little bit on that, because if I wouldn't be involved in a project where they use heavily RxJs, I can see a lot of problems that you might face, and it might just be overkill. And from a framework perspective, I would also say Angular should not be relying on RxJs, even though it's breaking my heart. But I think the barrier to get into Angular would be way lower without RxJs. And the thing is, everyone that knows RxJs would still be able to use it, but not everyone, because right now the impression is you're using Angular, you have to use RxJs, even though that's not really the case. But I think it would be way easier for many people to get into Angular if there's not this extra added layer of complexity. Yeah.
So, okay, another question on the same point. So how you convince the team members, right? So whenever this discussion happens, okay, we should use promises and observables.
There was actually so far not a major discussion about that. It was always like, at the beginning point of time, this is more like a convention. Should we stick with observables? Do we use observables when needed? And I'm mostly aiming for consistency. So I also make rules like, okay, if we use form, just let's stick with reactive forms always, because everything you can do with template-driven forms, you can do with reactive forms, but not the other way around. And I'm a big fan of consistency. Again, I worked with a lot of junior developers that did a great work, but I would not force them to use RxJs and to make them slower in their development process, and also give them a hard time debugging RxJs. Yeah, so to convince someone to use RxJs, it's pretty easy. Just the way everything you can do with a promise, you can do with an observable. And actually, promises have a lot of problems that it seems easier in the beginning, but there are a lot of problems that you might face when you're also not that aware of that. So I actually tried recently, like, using a weight properly, and I was always like in this RxJS flow trying to do things, and it was just not working. And I was like, I don't get it. Why can't I not just use an observable here in concat map? I would just be done already. Yeah. So there are definitely several arguments for observables, but the complexity is definitely an argument against it.
So that's cool. So, again, going back to the point, so we actually wrote the entire application, the entire framework actually without using our observable. But once I moved on to the new project, I realized that, okay, if I use RxJS operators properly, I think you can remove a lot of codes if I'm using functional approach and versus reactive approach. So this is one of the advantage which I could figure out. Okay, now I can remove a lot of codes which is unnecessary. I remember I removed more than 1,000 lines of code from my, just moving to, even not using RxJS properly, just moving to async pipe.
Yeah, fair.
So, so that's something I think, so what do you think where we need to actually improve? Either it's Angular docs or maybe RxJS docs where we should focus?
So from my point of view, the RxJS docs need to improve heavily. And I also had a lot of discussions by now with David from the Angular docs team. From my perspective, the Angular docs should not cover what is an observable.
Yep.
The problem is
Agreed.
You have to somehow put them in a position where they can use observables, but you also have different users when you're looking at docs. So, and this is particular in RxJS the case, because when you're coming from Angular background, you either have people that are already using and knowing RxJS maybe, or you have people that are just in the mood like, okay, I now have to do this observable stuff. I don't want to deal with that. Just give me the solution I want, pretty much. And those are completely different like layers of information that you need to provide. And from my point of view, this should not be part of the Angular docs. What should be in the Angular docs is like, okay, you don't know observables, go to the RxJS docs. You want to do reactive forms, please go to the reactive forms docs page. The thing is, in the RxJS docs, we are still facing this problem of having like super advanced users that just want to know like, okay, I have to use the window toggle operator, and there's this weird quirk. Please give me that piece of information that I need, even though no one needs window toggle. But on the other hand, we have those people that are like, okay, I now have an observable here. How do I get values out of that? So it's like completely different approaches and information that you need to provide. And we're still not in a very good spot with the docs to cover all of those. So we are working on improving the general introduction section, like, okay, what is an observable? What is an observer? What the fuck is a producer and stuff like that? So like high level information and connecting the dots pretty much. What I would like to have, and I think is also valuable, would be like first a tutorial section, like the Tour of Heroes to kind of compare it, but also like a cookbook. So I don't know, you want to do polling with RxJS, here you go. You want to do, I don't know, scenario-driven development, pretty much like.
Yeah.
And in best,
got it. I mean, this is
in best case even framework dependent, because you would, if we were talking about like, okay, how can I universally handle errors in Node.js, for example, with RxJS? This is completely different kind of approach you would take than you would do in an Angular application. But this is actually, so like having JavaScript or TypeScript-based examples would already be very good. And from there on, going on to having framework dependent, that would be really cool.
Yeah. I think Vanky has the same thing. So he was like, RxJS is overwhelming, but to create interest, we need to create some playground, which you already mentioned, right? So
yeah,
of course, if we have more real world examples, I think the first thing which came to my mind when I started with Angular was, is RxJS part of Angular itself? I was like, for a longer period of time, I was in the same situation, and then I realized, okay, no, it's a different library altogether and can be used anywhere. So people have to, I think we have to teach developers that, okay, you can use RxJS anywhere, just not Angular.
Yeah.
So of course, this is where the real world examples will help them. That's really cool.
I honestly think a version of Angular without RxJS would be fantastic for many people. Or what would be an approach would be like, so we basically just have, so you don't have to use reactive forms, right? You can just use template-driven forms. You have to use RxJS for the router at some point of time.
Yeah.
And the router you can even mitigate with activated route snapshot, technically. The only thing that is right now, as it is difficult to handle, is observables. And if you would have a HTTP client kind of like module that use Axios under the hood or something like that, you would be in a very sweet spot for many people.
That's cool.
I think this would be very valuable for many people.
I think I do agree.
Again, when I say stuff like that, my heart is bleeding, like saying like, oh no, don't do that, don't do that. But I do think for people that start with Angular, it would be a much better experience.
Actually, it will be easy to understand. I think it's easy to adopt.
Yeah,
and we can also show the difference, right? It's RxJS is not Angular,
yeah,
or
Yes.
Angular is actually not using RxJS always. So I mean, that's pretty good. So now let's come back to the question where so how you started. I mean, how you started thinking reactively, right? This is the thing which you want to discuss.
I think this was a very, very slow process, and it really just put me there by doing one example after another, more or less. So the first big reactive feature that I implemented, and I'm still a little bit proud of it just because it was pretty cool, was like a carousel element, which you can navigate with touch and like with mouse and stuff like that. And there's timer involved and stuff like that. And just having that, all this gesture support and having like tiny animations and stuff like that, that was pretty nice to do with RxJS. And this was also where I had a lot of gotchas like, oh, okay, this is why switch mem need to go on the inner observable instead of the outer, because that's the way it's working and stuff like that. But this is already pretty advanced, so I had a fairly good understanding already before. I think what also helped me is just by doing, I would pretty much suggest everyone who wants to get more into RxJS, take one example after another and implement it. Like the RxJS 101 is like a type ahead search. This is like the first starting point from my point of view, where what you should, if you want to get into that, like, okay, do a to-do list, start with a to-do list and add a search bar to it that you implement reactively. Another thing that I can recommend is like endless scrolling, but like in a way more like a virtuous scrolling, so that you're replacing elements on the scroll event and stuff like that. Another thing that is actually pretty cool with RxJS is polling. I can always recommend this, just because polling particularly, there are so many different approaches how you could implement it with RxJS, and all of them have their advantage and disadvantage. So it's like also pretty cool, because like the first thing you would do is like, okay, let's use a timer in switch map, for example. So you would just say like, okay, use the timer, and every time the timer ticks, you would try to hit the API or whatever. But in the end, if the API replies slow, what happens is that you're always just canceling that. So what you would usually do is like, if there's an ongoing API request, just cancel the tick and go to the next one, something like that. So there are pretty interesting approaches how to do that. And this is actually, it sounds really dry, because usually when you're starting learning Angular, you would say like, okay, you should build a tiny application here, or go to the Angular docs, or do this and that, sit down in a workshop, whatever. For RxJS, I don't think docs make that much sense for RxJS, because it's an abstract concept you have to learn. It's not, if you hit that barrier and say like, okay, I got observables, I know how operators are working, I just need to learn some operators, then you just go to the docs. That's what docs are for, from my point of view. But to help you understanding this process of how does this program flow works is kind of comparable if the Java docs would explain object-oriented programming. And this is very difficult. This is more like something you have to do somehow. And from my point of view, building stuff is the best way to do this.
That's really cool. So I think last week I saw this this website on our Twitter feed. A lot of people were actually sharing it. So RxJSfruits.com actually gives you, I think, around up to level 16, where you can write your code and it will make the changes in your UI, and you can see how RxJS works internally by just creating a fruit game. So that's really cool. I mean, I can see people are actually doing a lot of advanced stuff. I'm really amazed to see wow. I mean, people are actually that much into RxJS, and they are able to do it with less line number of codes. If I'm not wrong, if I have to write the same thing in maybe JavaScript or TypeScript by using DOM, I will be like taking maybe many days, many thousands of lines of code to do the same thing. So yeah, that's really cool. I mean, I do agree that when so the best thing or best way to actually learn is actually go ahead and write the RxJS code. So that's cool. Okay, so again, so now, of course, so once I will just ask one more question
Go
before
for
we
it.
move on to the next question. So if you have to actually explain, let's say, observable and observer, right? So in simple term, how you will explain it? Maybe
Okay.
giving some real time example.
Yeah. So observable, I usually refer to an array because that's so the difference is just that so an observable by default is an unspecified amount of values over an unspecified amount of time. What does that mean? You can get 0 values, but you can also get infinite values in an infinite amount of time. So they might just come at some point of time and sometimes not. And to understand this is already very, very crucial, because if you're already in this headspace, like, okay, my observable could emit something, but also could not emit something, you're always in that error scenario. So this also helps you to make your code more reliable from my point of view. So in easy terms, an observable is an undefinite and an infinite amount of values over an infinite amount of time. This is very abstract already, but you can kind of think about it as an asynchronous array. That's probably which might be expanded at some point of time, kind of like that.
Okay.
And an observer is actually fairly comprehensible because it's just an object that specifies the callbacks. So an observable specifies 3 channels. So you can have a next emission, you can have an error emission, and you have a complete emission. And error and complete are distinct. So you can either have an error or complete, but you don't need to have those. So if you have an infinite observable, it will just emit values and never complete. And the observer is just the specification of those callbacks. So what do you want to do if the next events happen? What do you want to do if the error event happens? And what do you want to do if the complete event happens?
That's cool. So okay, again, coming to the same point. So when I started learning RxJs, I think I tweeted up a few days ago. So I've been in this project, I've been using RxJs properly because of my coworker, or Serkan, right? So Serkan, so you might have met him. So he used to always explain me. So whenever I have any question related to RxJs, of course, he's my coworker. So I used to actually go ahead and catch him. Dude, I need some help.
Very good approach.
And he was always ready to actually always help that, okay, how he used to actually explain, okay, well, how thing works. And then finally I figured out that, okay, whenever you are working with RxJS, just keep one thing in your mind, that you are always going to need that value. And this is how you will learn. If you think, okay, I have called a function, let's say I call add function, 1 + 2 returns 3, that's it. No, it's not like that. So you have to always think, okay, anyone can actually add the value. So of course, I'm adding a value, then another user can come again, add some value. So it will be like continuous process, infinite number of arrays, as you said. And then you will start thinking reactively, okay, this is what actually we mean. And then you will be able to relate into Angular. Otherwise, it will be really difficult to. And this is the entire learning process which we have. That's where it makes RxJS plus Angular a lot complicated. So yeah. So next question is how you will start. Let's say you know about observables, but how you will start utilizing the operators. So what you think are some operators which you should learn first, and then start into diving deep into more operators?
Okay, so I would actually first start with those that you're probably already, to some extent at least, familiar with. So like map and filter. At least when you're using arrays and ES6, you should be able to use those. And I honestly so if you want to use RxJS, there's literally no way around those operators. If you go on there, you should also take a look maybe at from to create an observable properly. So there's like a handful of operators, maybe like 2 handfuls. So from, map, filter, at some point of time, you have to deal with one higher order observable, like using switch map or something like that. I personally, if you're not super familiar with that, would generally recommend concat map. Just use concat map. you might not have the most performant code, but it will probably also not be a problem for you. While the others could technically cause some problems. So this would be the fourth one. You should also think about error scenarios, like catch error, so that you at least be able to like, okay, my HTTP server might not always reply with a good, with the proper answer. How do I handle that? Usually, the next one that I would recommend then is like combine latest, so that just that you're able to combine multiple observables, and then you're already in a pretty good spot. I think take would be another good one, but this is also fairly comprehensible compared to the others. So I think with those 6, you can already build very, very reactive applications, actually.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, if you just for a start, I would probably recommend those. If you want to dive a little bit deeper, I would also take a look at scan and merge. Those are some that I use a lot. And share replay. And then you have like 10 operators, and then you can already build pretty neat stuff.
Oh, that's cool.
And honestly, also with my knowledge, I guess I don't use more than 30 operators.
30. Okay.
So some of them are very theoretically, and we just keep them because it would be a breaking change to remove those. So right now we have 104 or 105, something like that, operators, plus all the creation operators. So you're roughly around 150 operators. There's no need, no benefit in learning all of those. I promise you. Like,
that's true.
So we even have like statistics from Google, and I think like, for example, even Google is not using the window operator. And when we are looking at those, always like, who the fuck would use that? Why do you want that? You just want to delete it.
I mean, it once you are dependent, I mean, your users are dependent, it's really hard to change the APIs. So
yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead and take some questions, and then we'll see. Next question: what would be the proper ways we could handle side effects in RxJS?
So what I see very often is that people are using map, taking the value, doing a side effect, and returning the same value. This is actually not what map is intended for. Map is always some kind of transformation, and therefore should also be a pure function from my point of view. I always recommend to use tab, because that's what tab is designed for, like for any kind of side effect. And I would also split the side effect and the pure transformation. So if you say, okay, I need to do a transformation and a side effect, I would first do tab and then map, or the other way around, doesn't really matter. I would do it like that. And if you have it grouped in a tab operator, and you figure out afterwards, okay, the side effect here is not needed, I can make it completely pure, you just have to delete that tab operator and you're good to go. But also, I would not aim to, so for sure I would, at least to some extent, aim to be as pure as possible, but at some point of time, you will just face the need of a side effect and then just go with tab and you're good to go.
Okay. But if I remember correctly, last time I saw tab was supposed to be deprecated.
Nah. I think at least no. So what is the thing? There is a deprecated signature for tab. Because what we did is we deprecated some subscribed signatures. So before RxJS 6.5.4, something like that, you had a lot of possibilities what you can put in the subscribe method. And for reference, the tab signature support the tab has the same signature as subscribe, because they work the same. They provide all callbacks for the observer, and you can react to that. But the thing is, you were able to pass everything to subscribe literally. So what could be a problem is, like, if, for example, if you just wanted to specify the complete callback to trigger a side effect when complete happens, what you have to do is like specifying 2 null callbacks so that those don't trigger, and then you had null anonymous function for complete. This is completely nonsense, and no one is able to read that properly. So what we did is pretty much for every signature where you had to, or where you needed to provide null before, like for example, also for error and this kind of stuff, we deprecated those. So you're supposed to specify all anonymous functions, or otherwise, if you just want to specify the complete, please provide an observer object where you have like complete and then a callback function. That's what we deprecated.
Okay, that's good. So one more thing we actually didn't discuss about is what I love about RxJS operators are you can actually chain them, right? So you can just call tab,
yes,
you can call map, and then do everything, and at the end you get an observable. So that's a really cool thing about RxJS. If you are going to try it in future, you're listening to this episode, I would suggest try to use as operators in the pipe.
Yes,
and so just to just to ask you, Jen, so how you will simplify the pipe operators, right? Because whenever people start, they get confused. Okay, I don't have to subscribe. Okay, that's absolutely fine. But what this pipe is doing, so how you will simplify that?
Okay. Actually, to understand the concept of pipe, for me, it really helped me to look at the source code, because the only thing that pipe is doing, and this is where the thing where it absolutely makes sense, because usually when you nest functions, right? Because this is observables or operators are nothing else, right? You're nesting functions. So you say, okay, I first want to do a transformation, then I want to handle an error and stuff like that. So what you would have to do is you're nesting them, and then they're executed from the most inner function to the outer, because that's how JavaScript works, right? And no one is able to read that and understand that and process that. It just doesn't make sense. It's not working in my brain. If you're reading, usually you're reading from left to right, but what you would have to do is read from the inner to the outer. And then you're like, wait, so like this map is executed before this, and you're walking backwards. This is just bananas. So, and what the pipe is really just doing, it's like it's executing the functions in order, and then pass the argument, the result of the first function to the next operator. This is all that the pipe function is actually doing. For people that are not, that don't want to deal with RxJS that much, what I would recommend is actually subscribe as soon as possible. Don't even deal with operators. And do your logic in the subscribe function. Because moving from there to use operators and simplify your code is easier than having to do everything, right? So this is what I would recommend you. There's one exception to this rule. Don't subscribe in a subscribe function. Never do this.
Cool. Okay, so let's take some questions, Jan. So we have my first question: merge versus merge map. So
so merge is applying a merge strategy. Who would think that? So what it does, you're passing a list of observables to it. It subscribes to all of those, and as soon as one emits, it will emit as the output observable that very value, not in an array or not in a group way or anything. It's just that plain value. What merge map is doing, and this is actually also took me a while to understand that. On a high level, first of all, what happens is, so you have a source observable, and then you're applying merge map to it, and you're merge mapping to a different observable. So first of all, what happens is, because we are specifying a function there, this function is executed with every input with every emission of the input observable. So imagine our input observable emits 2 values, then we execute this function 2 times, which means we have 2 unique observables that we subscribe to. So, and now what merge map is doing is it's applying the same strategy of how to handle those values coming out of those observables as merge would do, dealing with multiple observables. That means if we have concurrent emissions on both observables, we will just output each of those. So we subscribe to all of those observables and output the values out of that. And this is actually one of the problems that could happen with merge map, because there's no way of there's no concurrency involved in there. So we just emit all the values coming. And technically, if you, for example, very pragmatic example, if you would perform record deletions of something on merge map, what could happen technically is that the second delete happens before the first one, and you would get notified about that in this order. And depending on how you structure your code, this could become a problem. Imagine like a bank account transfer. You want to have that in that same order you did the transactions, right? You don't want to, just because the backend for some reason replied faster, you don't want the second transaction happen before the first transaction. So this is how merge and merge map works, pretty much.
Okay, cool. So there is another question. Best way to, from Soumya, best way to caching HTTP request, publish replay or share replay?
So from my point of view, it depends on what you're doing. Because the thing with publish replay is that it's subscribing immediately to your observable, depending on what signature you're using. But it's subscribing immediately to your source observable. And therefore, pretty much as soon, so usually you're using observables as a property of a class. So as soon as this is instantiated, you will perform that HTTP request, which might be what you want. Don't get me wrong. What share replay would do if you're not using ref count, which I personally would not recommend you, it would do the very same. There are some slight difference, and Nicholas has a fantastic blog post about that, how share replay without ref counting behaves differently from publish replay. But when I use share replay, I usually use the ref count parameter because that's the way I imagine or I assume it would work. So what then happens is that as long as you have subscribers, you cache that value, and you will always, to new subscribers, will return that value. If you're in a scenario where you're constantly removing the subscribers and resubscribing again, then share replay is a weird kind of caching behavior, at least with ref counting. So it really depends on what you're doing. Another scenario for how you could cache HTTP requests actually might also be just using a behavior subject. This also works depending on what you're doing.
Or use NGRX.
Or use NGRX. True.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so Frankie has this question. Is there any way in RxJs to auto unsubscribe similar to async without manual code? So exactly.
So the thing is about that, auto unsubscribe is kind of weird because you're just unsubscribing depending on some kind of event. So for example, you want to couple it to your component lifecycle, then you want to unsubscribe. RxJs doesn't think in terms of components and stuff like that.
Exactly.
You can leverage that mechanism with take until and providing another observable, which is your trigger for unsubscribing, but this is not like an auto unsubscribe. You could do take one. So the take operator and pass one as value. So you're saying, okay, I just want one value and then you should complete, which is still not really an auto unsubscribe because technically your observable does not have to emit one value and then you're still subscribed. So easy answer, no, isn't any.
Cool. So we'll take one question from Twitter, which we got. So let's take that. So the question is lifecycle of observables, how they differ from events, how they reside in micro and macro task queue. Okay.
So regarding micro and macro task queue, because this is already kind of a misconception about observables. And I actually did this in my company the other day. So like when I ask people, okay, are observables synchronous or asynchronous? Everyone says an observable is asynchronous, which is wrong. Without shaming anyone, like I had this concept as well. I always, when I try to test observables, I was like, yeah, but this is asynchronous. How can I do this? The thing is, and actually the correct answer to is an observable synchronous or asynchronous would be an observable is as synchronous as possible. What does that mean? As long as you're just doing synchronous stuff, your observable is completely synchronous. For example, you're doing off and pass an array to that. You subscribe to that, console log that value. This is completely asynchronous, completely synchronous. Oh my God, sorry. This is completely synchronous. Just when you're using promises HTTP calls and stuff like that, or asynchronous scheduler or whatever, then your observable becomes asynchronous. So in terms of micro or macro task, it just depends on what the fuck you're doing. So when you're using promises, it will be a micro task, I guess. If you're doing HTTP or XHR calls, it's macro task and stuff like that. So it's really just depending on what you're doing. In terms of the life cycle of an observable, it's pretty much just like that. As soon as you subscribe, you get values till it completes, or errors. That's the life cycle of an observable. But the important thing is you have to subscribe. And if you don't get any values, you forgot to subscribe.
Yeah, exactly. That's the first thing which I teach as well. Yes. Okay, so let's take a few more questions. With reactive programming, we can delay the decisions until things happen. With an async pipe, can delay an HTTP call until we have to show it. Do you have any idea?
Let me read that question real quick. We can delay the decision until things happen. An async pipe can delay an HTTP call until we show it. Yes, if you use it in okay, so I think for at least from what I understand is if you're using Angular async pipe and this would perform an HTTP call, when the viewer renders, then it would perform that HTTP call because it's subscribed to that. It's a call observable. As soon as you subscribe to it, it executes the logic. And you could use that in combination with ngIf. Then it would just show that piece of HTML as soon as you got a reply from that HTTP server. I think this is what you're asking. I hope so. If not, if I'm too fast for something or not, everything is completely clear. Feel free to contact me on Twitter afterwards or now or whatever. I'm always happy to help.
Cool. Okay, another question from Ramesh. With NGRX, we have to decide when to load it to store. What's your recommendation on loading data reactively?
So first of all, if we're talking about NGRX, I always bring up the topic, okay, do we want to use NGRX just for state management, or do we also want to use the effect mechanism? Because NGRX store is not that reactive. You don't have to understand many reactive concepts to deal with it properly. You have to use store select and that's it. Then you can subscribe to get the values that works. Effects are pretty reactive and you have to understand a lot how observables work to use them properly and in a correct way. So I personally would, many teams that I worked with that used effects would not recommend to use them just because they didn't have that knowledge about it. And one easy thing you have to, from my point of view, is if you understand switch map and those things correctly and you know how to apply them, then you're probably ready to use effects. If you're just saying, okay, I use switch map because it seems about right, you're probably not ready. So this is the first thing. And for the other thing, what to put in the store and what not, there's a fantastic talk by Mike Ryan about when to use NGRX and when not. And this is pretty much the same question, because as soon as you leverage that kind of knowledge, like what do I even want this global state for, then you come in the position to say like, okay, I actually just need it if many components need that same the same kind of state. Then you probably want to put it in a state store. There are different factors that play into that as well. So I mentioned before, like I like consistency. So if I work with a big team, I would rather tend to say like, okay, just put more or less everything in the store and don't build a service for that just because you don't want to share it. In big projects, at some point of time, you want to share it usually. So there are some more factors, but like easily say, watch when to use NGRX by Mike Ryan. Afterwards, you will probably understand.
Cool. So in one of the episodes, Armin mentioned this, that if your application is like big enough to use Angular, you should use NGRX. So that's the term he used.
So in terms of that question, I usually like to go simple with just with behavior, subject, and services. That's usually my approach to that. If you have like big projects, big team or like huge fluctuations, so like team members come and go, those are factors where I would say like, okay, let's go with NGRX because it's a very known pattern. Many people that are using Angular know that pattern and know how to apply NGRX. So those are factors where I would say, okay, use NGRX.
Cool.
And right now, for example, I'm also in a situation where I work with a lot of junior developers. So I like this consistency even more so that they can understand a concept and then apply it. That's easier than saying like, yeah, okay, I applied it here, but here I don't need to apply that, right? To take this mental shift as well. So there are some situations. I personally would rather do subjects and services.
Cool. Okay, so we'll take 2 more questions probably. So this is one question from Guru Raj. So what is memory leak? Why we need to unsubscribe?
Okay. So memory leak just means I have something in memory that shouldn't be there. That's more or less the easy term described. In terms of RxJS, that's usually the scenario when you have a long-living observable and your component is destroyed already because you switched to view, whatever, but your subscription is still there. And in worst case, this can even lead to race conditions or weird errors that are barely able to, that you will find out what's happening there. And this is the reason. So just imagine your component is destroyed. It's in your subscribe function. You're calling this dot whatever, some kind of property equal to the value. If your component is already destroyed, but your subscription isn't destroyed yet, what happens is that your this is not the component anymore, but undefined. And you will say, okay, undefined dot whatever property, you get an exception, and your application is dead.
That's the best way to describe.
Yes, and therefore also technically, if you know your observable always emits something and there's just a single value, technically you're right. You probably don't need to unsubscribe. On the other hand, this is not thinking reactively, because thinking reactively say when that happens, do that. And not I know this happens and so I want to do that. And therefore, I usually recommend just to unsubscribe every time when you know you want to unsubscribe and you're good to go. It's easier to say unsubscribe every time than to say, yes, you need to unsubscribe here, and yes, no, you don't need to unsubscribe here.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so let's take another question. This is again from Twitter. So how the matching is working? So I'm not sure what this question is, but if you understand it.
So what I can imagine what kind of matching is referred here is in distinct until change, maybe. Because in filter, in the filter operator, you're passing your matching function. Let's say, okay, so this is describing what value get bypassed and not. In distinct until change, and this is also an error that I see often, it's just under the hood, it's just doing a triple equal check. What does that mean? It's checking the reference. This works well with primitives. This does not work if you're using immutable objects. Then your distinct until change is completely pointless. But you can specify a compare function to distinct until change. It's barely used, but when you're dealing with objects, it's usually better to do that.
Okay, cool. Okay, so another question is difference between cold observable and versus hot observable. I think that's a really hot question as well.
Yes, I completely agree. So I first want to clear some misconception here, because the thing is when I ask people what is a hot observable, 99% of the answer is like an observable that emits infinite amount of values, which does not complete, which is wrong. And the thing here is a cold observable, all the creation logic of the producer, so where the values come from, are depending on the subscribe call. This is what a cold observable is. So easy example, the timer operator. What timer does, it's calling set interval under the hood, and then emits the value of the time amount you specify. So if you set into timer is a cold observable, which means you subscribe to it, the set interval is created, and will be passed to that subscriber. Which also means if you have multiple subscribers, you will get distinct values from each other. each of those subscribers get their own set interval under the hood. If you would have that in a hot observable, what would that mean is you create this observable, the set interval is created immediately, and every subscriber would just get the values of that point of time. So their hot observable means the producer instance is somehow not related to the subscribe process, while a cold observable means inside the subscribe method, the producer is created, and therefore everyone has its own producer. That's a big difference. And the easiest example to understand that properly is referring to a subject, because in a subject, you can subscribe to that, even though you won't get any values till next are called. And this is nothing to do with the subscriber itself. So you can call next, even though you don't have a subscriber, right? And this is the best way to think of a hot observable, because you can have values without having a subscriber.
Cool. Okay, now we are just nearing the end of the session. So let's see this question. So which is asked, I'm sure you know who asked this question, so I don't have to tell you, but just for our listeners. So this was asked by Nicholas Jemison, who is the core member of RxJs team. So your answer.
That's a very difficult answer. And it's also very dependent on my mood, because I so far just had like a handful of whiskeys that I really don't like. Some of my favorites are definitely very fruity whiskeys, like Abalur, for example, which were at some point of time in a wine cask, so they are like have a lot of flavor of wine and like very fruity. And on the other hand, I also like very peated whiskey, which are like you could basically just burn a cigarette and drink it, more or less. So in that terms, if I would have to, I can't pick one. I can pick two, and then we have on the one hand Abalur Dabunda, I think it's their cask whiskey. It's an amazing one, and the Lafroig, 15 years old.
I don't drink, so I don't have any idea about what
you don't drink at all.
Nope.
Me neither.
That's really cool. Okay, so we just reached at the end of the session, Jan. So there is anything you want to promote, or maybe you want to tell our...
Promote. That's a good thing. So one thing would definitely be the RxJs beta release, which I would like everyone to check out. So it's similar as Angular. It's also running in Google, so it should be pretty stable. But the more people that look at it, the better feeling we get with the next major release. And we're actually pretty close to the next major release. So we didn't commit it on a date, and I'm pretty sure we don't have a date so far in mind. But we are pretty close to finishing the next major release. So this would be a thing. And if you are also interested in RxJs and depending libraries and stuff like that, I would want you to check out RxJs-web, which is pretty much a third-party library I'm writing right now to provide observable wrappers for web APIs. So like, for example, the geolocation API and stuff like that. I think the biggest benefit for this library is on like PWAs, where you're relying a lot on those web APIs. But I'm happy to have any kind of feedback. So if you say like, this API would be cool to have, or this API is completely useless because I can just use promises, very valuable feedback for me.
Cool. So I will add the links in the description later on.
Cool.
Yep. And yep, so we just reached at the end of the session. So we took like 10-15 minutes extra, but there were like a lot of amazing questions. And thanks a lot for actually joining us and asking those questions, because this is something which will be recorded and will be available for everyone, so they can go through it.
I really enjoyed it. It was super fun. Like, great questions.
Thanks, Jan. And of course, so we'll just talk a little bit about our next episode. So in next episode, we are going to have Alex Akrushko, who is part of NGRX core team. And we will be talking about state management for web. So it's not NGRX. So we are not going to talk about NGRX anymore. And it will be general how you can manage your state for your web application applicable for all the frameworks, maybe even without frameworks. So that's what we are going to discuss about next Friday, same time. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can get the alerts in case whenever we are having our next episode. And I'll also ask you to go ahead and check out Ben Lash. I think this is the Twitter handle, BNLESH. So you can get all the updates on the latest releases about RxJs. So he's tweeting, I think from last few weeks, he's all continuously actually writing about RxJs, how the optimization things are going on, how the beta is coming up. So you can also subscribe to, or just go ahead and follow him.
He's also just a super fun dude. So I cannot recommend enough to check out his Twitter.
Yeah, sure. I'll just add the handle for all RxJs core team members in the description, and then you can follow them. So thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot for joining us. Thanks a lot, Nicholas, Jan, for giving us your valuable time and
thanks for having me,
answering all those questions. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.